pipeline from Machynlleth to Aberystwyth was to be laid by Wales Gas. The first phase would run 11 kilometres and would have to be completed within 6 months. The weather, the composition of the soil and the lie of the land would affect the work. And it would require agreements with people through whose land the pipeline would pass. But there would be another consideration too: the generations of other people who had also lived there and whose physical and material remains lay undisturbed beneath the surface of the land. For this last consideration, Wales Gas regularly informed the Dyfed Archaeological Trust of work they are planning, so that any sites that may be threatened can be recorded for future generations. The Trust's computerized records list over 20,000 sites known in the county. And although it was only the first phase of work that would take place in Dyfed, a strip only about 5.5 miles long, the records showed that even that limited stretch was rich in archaeological sites. A 19th century industrial area, a Roman road, an Iron Age enclosure, 2 prehistoric cooking sites, and 2 standing stones with a burial mound nearby. Although the entire route would be investigated, the most promising area for excavation was around 1 standing stone on the grounds of the Welsh plant breeding station at Plas Gogerddan. From aerial photographs, 1 round barrow was quite obvious. And it looked as if there might be 2 more right on the pipeline route. Discussions began among all parties involved to devise a cooperative plan. Wales Gas agreed to help with post-excavation expenses. The plant breeding station allowed the Trust to excavate around 1 standing stone, and the Trust agreed to carry on its work with as little interference as possible to Wales Gas. The only thing needed was people to carry out the excavation. So the Manpower Services Commission funded a community programme through the Ceredigion District Council, and an advertisement was placed in the Aberystwyth Job Centre.
I've always been into archaeology. It's an amateur hobby of mine, so I thought, well, I'll bash it, see what it's like. It is really pleasant to work out of doors rather than just sitting in an office all day looking at a green screen or something.
I was always interested in history at school, but I've never actually done anything about it till now.
I've never seen a job with archaeology before in the job centre. It was something quite new.
Ken Murphy, the excavation director, has worked on several excavations of standing stones.
We know what the remains we would expect to find around a standing stone, and usually these range from cremations and some later inhumation burials to a whole range of post holes, pits and so forth, ritual pits surrounding stones. The type of remains you expect to find on a site really depends very much on how much it's been ploughed in the past 3,000 or 4,000 years since the standing stone was erected.
Ploughing had been extensive at Plas Gogerddan, and yet the story began right in the topsoil. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the estate had its own racecourse, which circled the standing stones. Pieces of clay pipes began to appear, along with broken bottles, which had once contained port wine. The stone was probably a gathering point for the gentry while the races were going on. Later in the excavation, an 1816 sixpence showing the head of George III was found. Perhaps it was someone's lost bet on the horses. This propelling pencil had also been dropped. As the topsoil was taken away, the Bronze Age features began to appear. One was a kist.
Kist is basically a small stone-lined pit, a box if you like, made of flat slab-like stones. They're very common in all periods of prehistory in Britain and also into the post-Roman period and later. But in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, they seem to be primary for cremation deposits.
Some remains are not visible to the naked eye, so samples were sent to St David's University College, Lampeter, to see if there were any charcoal which could be dated, or whether any bone remained. Around the stone were a number of pits and post holes, which formed no coherent plan. Further away were 3 very large post holes, which would have held posts, perhaps up to 10 meters high. They may have been set there before the stone was raised, or may have been markers contemporary with the stone, but there is no way to tell. There was also a charcoal-filled pit, cut by a small grave, and a small area that was slightly reddish in colour, and may have had a fire on it at one time. We cannot be certain why these pits were dug, but they may have held the remains of ritual feasting after burial rites. The stone, in fact, may not have been the most important feature of the site at all, but that it was part of an extensive ritual area is quite clear. Further away from the stone, actually on the line of the gas pipeline itself, were 3 ring ditches, 2 of which are visible on aerial photographs. The 2 largest form interlocking circles. The material from the ditches would have been upcast into the centre to form mounds, and usually they cover central burial pits.
On excavation at Gogerddan, no central burial pits were discovered, although it's possible that the burials were in fact incorporated into the body of the mound itself. And obviously as the mound has eroded over the intervening 3,000 or 4,000 years, so the burials have been eroded as well and completely destroyed.
Excavation of the ring ditches had to be done in 2 parts, because work was interrupted by the laying of a portion of the pipeline. Arnold Woolley, the site supervisor, noted the position of any features visible in the trench that could be excavated later. When the ring ditches were excavated, at least 2 burials were found which date to nearly 2,000 years after the stone was erected. One piece of evidence was a small bronze brooch, which would have fastened a cloak worn by the buried person.
It was just sort of popped up out of the ground at me. This very green thing. Quite incredible, really. After looking at lots of soil for a long time.
The story that emerges then is that standing stones were part of extensive ritual areas that were used off and on for many hundreds of years. But just how long this site was used was completely unexpected.
That was the portion where we'd found about 3 or 4 graves, and we thought it was an isolated family plot for burial. We had no idea of the cemetery aspect and the chapel that was coming up later.
Eventually, around 25 graves were discovered, all aligned east-west, and were assumed to date to early Christian times, the 5th to the 8th centuries. The foundation trenches of 3 buildings were also found, but all that remained of their timber walls was a dark stain in the ground.
Just inside the doorway of this structure was a small pit, a small stone-lined pit, which initially we thought may have been a small burial, an infant's grave in fact. But on one of the other structures we found a similar feature as the small stone-lined pit just inside the doorway. And in that one there was a small stain which indicated it had taken a small timber box as well. So it may be some sort of dedicatory offering.
Meanwhile, at one end of the pipeline, part of the team was excavating what was possibly a prehistoric cooking area. Throughout Dyfed, as well as in western and northern Britain and Ireland, is a type of site called a burnt mound. They appear as low mounds of burnt, cracked stone, and tell us something about domestic activities some 4,000 years ago. Experiments have tried to reconstruct how the mounds were used. It is thought that a pit was dug and filled with water, and then meat wrapped in a package of straw. Hot stones were added from a nearby fire to bring and keep the water at boiling point so that the meat could cook. In addition to producing clouds of steam and ash, the hot stones shattered and were tossed aside, forming the mound. Arnold Woolley suggested another theory about how the mounds were used.
It would have been obvious to the people who were dealing with this method of cooking that when they burnt the different kinds of rock, they came out with powders that formed different colours. Now, in the handling of those different coloured powders, they would have realised that their hands changed colour. You can produce white, you can produce black, you can produce greens, reds, and even a bluey colour.
Mixed with any oil, sap, or the white of an egg, the colour will stay on the skin. But it was what lay below the mound that could tell the most about the past.
We knew that we had very limited time. What we would have dearly liked to have found was either a cooking area associated with it or a hut area. But our problem was that time and the pressures that the farmer and the pipeline itself put upon us. We decided to cut a trench straight through the heart of the mound so that we could look at the stratification of the mound. We also knew that there was a great deal of peat, and we were trying to get into the peat level below the mound so that we could look at environmental evidence.
Once they got through the layer of clay, samples of peat and wood were set aside for analysis in the laboratory. At the far end of the pipeline was the village of Talabont, a former hub of manufacturing at the end of the last century. Water flowing from the rivers Ceylan and Lerry was directed over weirs, down watercourses and aqueducts, two wheels that powered the corn and flannel mills. One of these watercourses was uncovered by the preliminary work for the pipeline. It was a sunken waterway, with dry stone walls and massive capstones. It may have served a medieval lead mine, or any of several 19th century mills. In any case, the manual labour involved was considerable.
It gives the impression of somebody in the industrial side of things coming along to a landowner and saying, I need to power this piece of machinery down here. I need to take the water supply from that river at that point. And a landowner saying, well, you can do it provided you don't disturb my grazing. And then coming to an agreement that the thing could be constructed provided the land was reinstated over the top of it, so that virtually it didn't spoil the landscape and it didn't spoil the agricultural activity that was going on.
At the end of 6 months, the first phase of the pipeline was completed, and the sites were returned to their original state. Drawings and plans were finalised, and once the results were back from the laboratory, the final report could be written. The sample from beneath the burnt mound gave a picture of how the assortment of trees and shrubs had changed as the mound was gradually being formed. There was nothing identifiable in the sample from the kist. But the carbonised grain in the charcoal pit was dated to 3500 BC, 2,000 years before the standing stone was even erected. That means that the spot had been used off and on for at least 5,000 years.
I like being placed as an equal as well, and I was handed over pick and shovel like the rest of them.
The whole arrangement of the community programme means that you do sort of meet people that you wouldn't normally meet anyway.
You're looking at the evidence as it presents itself as you find it and trying to interpret it. And so it's quite a mysterious process in some ways. Yeah, there's plenty of interest in it.